Today's seminar is intended to do two things. Firstly, it's to give you a sense of what the Laureate Food Security Project is about, but it's also, I suppose, like a version of speed dating. It's to get to know some of you and for you to get to know some of the people in the project, because there is a lot of overlap, and I've been talking for a long time now with Robert Henry about ways that we can build things together. We've already struck a relationship with the Kakadu people coming forward. So the idea behind this is for me to give you a sense of what I'm working on with the Laureate team on our 5-year project, and then also to see if there's any synergies so we can work together going forward. A talk like this in other contexts, I would begin by talking about food security and what a pressing issue it is. It's clearly an audience, I don't need to address those things. What I do want to talk about here today is the role of intellectual property in relation to food security and what we're trying to do in this particular context. In putting together this project, we faced a number of different challenges. And at the same time as being challenges, we see them as great opportunities. And I just want to go through and explain what those are, because they really shape what we do, and they're shaping the project as it's going forward. The project's been going now for about nearly 12 months, and we're just about to get our our final quota of PhD students so the team comes together properly in the next couple of months, so we're pushing off going forward. There are two main issues and challenges that face or have arisen in this area. The first one is that intellectual property in food or intellectual property in agriculture has not been taken seriously at all to date. It is not sexy enough in people's mind. It is something that hasn't been taken seriously. People spend a lot of time talking about authors' rights for software engineers or artists or for musicians, downloading of mix-ups and things like that. The vast majority of intellectual property scholars are concerned with those things. If they ever move beyond those things, then they're always concerned with health. There's a handful of people in the world really who are concerned with agriculture and food. It's changing, but it's changing very slowly. I think probably one of the best examples that typifies this is the Australian Law Reform Commission, which is a policy body set up by the Australian government to look at key issues. It was convened about 8 or so years ago to look at gene patents in Australia. The first meeting, the first thing we decided, because I was on the committee, was that agriculture, plants and animals did not matter, and it was only going to consider health. And that attitude pervades and has continued on today. So that's one of the first issues that we've had to face. The second issue is that to the extent that intellectual property in food and agriculture have been studied, it's been very, very limited. The first limitation is the belief that intellectual property has not been important. It wasn't until, for example, in Australia, until the 1970s and 80s that the Plant Breeders' Rights or Plant Variety Rights scheme was introduced that intellectual property had any impact at all. And to the extent that anybody thinks about this all, there's a book by an economic historian called Raby that is one of the few people I know to address this topic. Is that patents in particular has been fairly irrelevant, if not completely irrelevant, to the subject of the development of Australian agriculture over the last 2 centuries. There also have been very, very few areas that have been taken seriously and studied. I'm putting together with a colleague in the team a collection of articles on intellectual property and food at the moment. And so what we're doing is going through and systematically looking at the literature. And a couple of things that are really quite striking. The first is that people are completely obsessed with geographical indications of origin, whether it's the champagne links or something. But there is 90% of the literature deals with GIs and access and benefit sharing. There's 1 or 2 articles on animals. There's virtually nothing on breeding. It's very, very limited to the extent it's been studied. The third problem with what's happened to date is the approach that's been adopted has been similarly very narrow. It's been very much policy-based in the worst sense. It's policy-based without any empirical understanding of the subject matter, and it tends to focus particularly on international treaties and their implementation in countries. So, for example, a lot of the literature is concerned with the Convention on Biological Diversity and what it might mean and how Australia implements the Nagoya Protocol, not about how scientists are having to deal with benefit sharing and feeding back into that process. Our response in some ways has been an attempt to deal with those challenges which we are treating as opportunities. And I suppose what we're trying to do in one sense is to carve out a new area of study, a new area of scholarship. And that's probably one of the overarching general aims of the project going forward. And in so doing, we are taking a few different things into account. The first one is that we believe that intellectual property potentially impacts upon all aspects of the food chain. I think it does impact in one way or the other on the food chain. From the collection and storage of genetic resources, through to breeding, through to the science that goes in relation to those processes, through to on-farm activities, precision farming, barbed wire patents, off-farm, the movement and transportation of goods, the packaging, storage and processing, the relationship with food with consumers, and then waste. At every point along the food chain, intellectual property potentially is relevant. And one of the issues that we have to address here is that in some ways intellectual property in food is all-encompassing. While there may not be too much overlap with artists' rights or moral rights, every other area is potential. Chemical patents occur all through the domain. Geographical indication of origin everywhere. So trademarks, patents, plant breeders' rights, copyright in data at every point along the food chain. And our challenge is, how do we differentiate our project from just a general project on intellectual property? And what we're trying to do is twofold. Firstly, we're trying to pick out those things that are particularly important. So, for example, access to genetic resources is something that's clearly very important, and we're studying that. We're also trying to work out those things that are unique within that particular process, and those things that have not been studied. So obviously biological protection is something that's very, very unique to this field, and it poses very specific problems. Also, there are other areas such as design law for boxes for food storage, transportation, movement of goods, are things that have been rarely studied, so we're looking at those things as well. So the first thing that we're trying to do is to look at intellectual property across the food chain. The second thing we're trying to do is, as well as looking at specific topics along the food chain, we're trying to think how intellectual property shapes and drives that food chain. So in the same way that supermarkets may dictate backwards and forwards along the food chain, we're trying to work out how is it that, say for example, a patent over a patent over the way in which chickens are processed may enable certain groups to control what type of chickens are bred and what type of chickens are consumed. We're trying to work out whether or not intellectual property in one area, so for example over plant breeders' rights, shapes something down the food chain. And one of the areas that we'll be looking at that we will be looking at going forward, that we think that provides a useful study is peanuts. And there's intellectual property protection over the germplasm. It's been a key part of the movement of peanut germplasm around the world, over the peanut processing, over the growing and processing, the packaging, trademarks and consumption. And it's one area where we think that we might be able to work out a way in which those different areas feed to and impact upon each other. And one of the members of the team will be embarking sometime soon on a project that looks at and embraces that across the board. Our approach in responding to the question of intellectual property is based upon three particular topics and three particular areas. And this is the thing I think that where we have the most opportunity for conversation going forward. And I just want to go through these in a little bit of detail and then open up for discussion about other possibilities or potential linkages. And I think that in a sense I would say that our research and our approach to our research can be divided into three different things, which are not separate, but they can be separated out and distinguished. Firstly, there's empirical. Secondly, there's a policy or doctrinal. And thirdly, historical. And they overlap to some extent, but they're things that we can distinguish. One of the things we're really committed to doing is to finding out what's happening. So one of the things we will be doing a lot is I'm sort of embarking empirical research, ethnographic, anthropological research, field work going forward. And we're just starting to actually getting ethical clearance at the moment to begin this particular process. I just want to give you an example of two projects that we're embarking on, and these are only just beginning and they're expanding as we're going forward. The first one is we've got two people in the team who are doing a critical review of the Queensland and Northern Territory biodiscovery laws and why they haven't worked. We'll be expanding very soon to look at the Kakadu plum, wild rice, hopefully, and other projects. We're trying here to get some information that we can feed into policymakers to sort of say what's going on. To date, most of the information that policy has been based upon and reform is based on speculation and conjecture, and there's been very little actual work that's been done. This is part of a bigger project that's looking at access to genetic resources across the Southeast Asian or Asian region. So we've got a workshop coming up in July, I believe, in Nepal, that's looking at plant breeders' rights and farmers' rights, that will bring together people with expertise in those domains going forward. And here again, it's to gather people with expertise to build an empirical base on which we can move forward. And that's one of the things that underpins everything we're doing. Another project based upon that, which is coming on soon, we're looking at endpoint royalties. Endpoint royalties is a Queensland innovation. It's one of the most, I think, interesting things ever to come out of Australian intellectual property law. It's basically a regime, for those who don't know, whereby intellectual property rights, instead of the plant breeder typically assigning the rights or giving the license at the point of sale, so when the tree or the seed is purchased, a contract is arranged with the purchaser, so there's a sharing of costs at the point of production. So it might be on harvest, or it might be on how much is processed. A whole range of different schemes have been developed. It was trialled in relation to wheat, and particularly in Australia. It now dominates, I believe. We are beginning a project that will begin in the next 9 months or so, looking at the mangoes in Queensland. It's a nice, neat, closed example that we can look at and focus on. This is an innovation, a Queensland-based innovation, which now dominates in Australian agriculture. It's also an innovation that's been picked up in Canada, and there are discussions in Europe as well. So we have an opportunity here to look at that in quite a bit of detail. There are a range of other empirical projects that we're going forward. We will be looking at possibly at technology and the impact of movement of genetic resources across boundaries going forward, transportation, how that works at customs. And there's a whole host of things, but I just want to give you a flavour of a couple of things that we're doing going forward. Secondly, and these, I must say, they're all related to each other, they're not distinct. But secondly, the focus is policy-based, or they're fairly close. I just want to give you a couple of examples of things we're thinking about. There is a couple of people within the team and a lot of people tangentially involved in thinking about the flexibility in lawmaking. Because one of the problems that arises in this domain is the question of what can be done to improve things. Like, people can come up with ideas, and then the policymakers and lawmakers will come back and say, oh, it's not possible, we can't do that because whatever it might be. Often this is just purely a matter of politics. And one of the things that's been interesting in Australia over the last decade or so is how the policy debate has shifted internally within the Australian government. Typically, intellectual property was dominated by Intellectual Property Australia and the Department of Foreign Affairs. And they took a fairly specific approach to intellectual property. So intellectual property is something that could be bargained to increase access to foreign markets for lamb. It wasn't something that was taken as seriously as a matter in its own right. And as a consequence, Australian law really just mimicked laws in other countries. About 10 years ago, the Department of Health decided that plain packaging of tobacco and getting Australians to smoke less was much more important than and so the Health Department managed to convince Cabinet and override the wishes of Intellectual Property Australia and the Department of the International, what it was called, the Department of Foreign Affairs at the time, and introduce plain packaging. Australia was the first country to introduce that law. It was challenged by the tobacco companies and upheld in Australia. It was challenged at the World Trade Organization, and according to my informed sources, there was a leak yesterday that has said Australia has won at the World Trade Organization the challenge brought by effectively the pharmaceutical companies via, I think, Nicaragua and Hong Kong, the governments thereof. Anyway, what we're looking at here is trying to find, are there similar areas and points of flexibility in the law. One of the projects that we're looking at here is lawmaking in Ecuador. Ecuador has developed a really interesting new regime, or they set out to develop a new regime. They're completely revising their intellectual property laws, their seed laws, and one of the people in the research team has spent some time in Ecuador looking at what's been happening there. And one of the things that's been interesting there is that most countries in the world are members of the World Trade Organization and TRIPS, the Trade-Related Intellectual Property System. One clause in that treaty, Article 27.3b, basically says member states must introduce, in relation to biological resources protection, either in the form of patents or plant breeders' rights or some sui generis protection. Sui generis is quite an open term, and in the past some countries, African countries, India, Thailand, Sri Lanka tried to develop new innovative ways of expanding on that. What's happened over the last decade or so, however, is that bilateral agreements. Australia now has agreements with most Pacific countries that lock them into a particular intellectual property framework. So what we're doing within this context is trying to work out how is it that there is flexibility built into the plant breeders' rights scheme, for example. And what we're looking at here, and this is something where I think we really benefit from input from the scientists and from QAAFI people in particular, is, for example, how do you distinguish and what is the basis of novelty and distinctiveness in different crops? All plant breed rights protection, all new plants to get protection must be distinct, uniform and stable. But it's something that the law is unable to deal with. It is crop specific. And so there's some attempt, say for example in Ecuador, to tweak with those particular measurements in order to example for the indigenous farmers to get some sort of protection. And so there's a lot of flexibility built into the sort of not the substantive rules, you must take out patents on plants, but on the way in which those things are implemented. So we're spending, and we'll be spending quite a bit of time looking at that particular, those particular nuances and subtleties going forward. We're also trying to look at ways in which things like the CRISPR technology, we are holding an event in September with QAAFI that's looking at the legal, social and ethical implications of CRISPR going forward. And here we're interested obviously in how CRISPR modified objects, I'm trying to be neutral in my language, how they are classified, but also has ramifications for things like novelty. How will the law distinguish whether something is new or not when it's CRISPR modified? And so we've got someone who will probably be working on this within the team going forward. We're certainly something about it at public discussion and public debate. We're holding a public forum here, which will probably be hosted by Radio National and the Big Ideas. So we're trying to stimulate public debate going forward. Another area that we're looking at, and hopefully we're having some people doing some work on this, is we were involved a couple of years ago with the CGR. The funders to the CGR were concerned about that some of the centres, CGR centres, were getting a little bit friendly with private sector partners and getting involved in this sort of problem. I'm trying to be politic in how I'm presenting this. There was some concern from the funders that it was inappropriate for centres, some centres, one or two centres in particular, who were very interested in taking out patent protection and PBR protection over innovations that they developed going forward. The CGR developed a set of principles for the management of intellectual assets that attempts to allow CGR centres to take out intellectual property protection and at the same time pursue their goals of food security and poverty reduction. And it's a really interesting dance that they're involved with. And it was introduced I think 2 years ago, 3 years ago now, and there's been little or no work done on the implementation of it. One of the things we're going to do go forward is we're going to go back and revisit that. And we've been in discussion with the people at the consortium office about undertaking a project looking at 4 or 5 of the centres to see what impact it's been having going forward. It scared a lot of centres, like the smaller centres had no involvement. The bigger centres who had 4 or 5 in-house lawyers, it was not an issue at all going forward. But there have been anecdotal stories about negative impacts, and there's been anecdotal stories about positive impacts, but we just want to do some work going forward. It is a really interesting role model for public sector agencies that have policy good as their sort of goal. How do you manage an organisation, a university, maybe not all universities, but some universities that have public good goals as their aim? How and when should you use intellectual property in order to achieve your goals? And this is a part of a reimagination of intellectual property that's happened over the last decade or so. Intellectual property for a long time was in a sense seen as a monopoly of the private sector. It was seen as something that you only had intellectual property protection to encourage investment in innovation going forward. And that's the way, it's the dominant way it's been thought about. But nonetheless, it's something that's been challenged, and it's something that we want to continue to do going forward. The third area that we're looking at is historical, and that's for a number of reasons. One is because it's very interesting. But secondly, there's a lot to be learnt from looking back at the history of intellectual property and agriculture and food. And I think there's a number of important lessons going forward, and it also gives us a better sense of how things are going to proceed in the future. So, for example, one of the things that we've been looking at is the role of the United States Patent Office. The US Department of Agriculture was formed in the Patent Office in the United States. So the Department of Agriculture grew out of the role of the Commissioner of Patents. The Commissioner of Patents decided that agriculture was very important and started to commission statistics and data. There were the greenhouses attached to the Patent Office where they grew crops. For about 40 or 50 years, in response to a food crisis that developed in America post the Civil War in particular, the US Patent Office gave out millions of free seeds to gardeners and farmers and things as a part of the process of expanding, pushing people across America. Most people see that as an aberration. We're seeing that as a very early example of the use of intellectual property and food security. Another regime that we're starting to do some work on are things called one variety laws. These are laws that they go under whole different names, and they occurred in many different countries. British colonial laws, America, Queensland, a lot of Australian states. These are laws that regulated and control what could be grown and how it could be grown and when it could be grown and who it could be grown by. There's been very little work done on these laws. 1880 through to about 1920 or 1930, these developed. A lot of them was to do with standardisation. The American cotton one variety laws were basically designed to ensure seed purity, purity of seeds growing, because there's no other mechanism to do so. They were very important precursors to all of the intellectual property laws going forward. So we're going to spend quite a bit of time looking at those and seeing how they developed and going forward. I did a little bit of work on the Queensland laws. There was some about the growing of bananas, and it was very interesting. It's one of the conditions for growing of bananas that you had only grow certain types of bananas. You also had to pass an English language proficiency test in North Queensland. It's about an early example of the attempt to control Queensland agriculture. I'm not sure who they were trying to exclude. I haven't done the work yet, but it was certainly white farmers from North Queensland were the ones they were trying to dominate. We're also doing work on, again, at the same period, and this is a period that we're sort of spending quite a bit of time on at this, or some of us are, at least at this early stages. The push for the pure food and drug laws in America dominated the world in across up into the 1920s. These are laws where people debated what is butter, what is margarine, and they spent a lot of time doing that. How do we know when something crosses state boundaries it is what it claims to be? This is very, very important now for debates going forward in Australia about the labelling of GM foods. It's all important when things are made in Australia. You've now got these, I haven't seen them, the kangaroo or the bar chart on the food that will tell you how much of something when it's purely Australian or not Australian going forward. Lots of really interesting examples at the time going forward in debating things like, it was chemicals and drugs at the same time, but the two of them went hand in hand. Another historical project that we're looking at, which is a very contemporary ramification, we're looking at dematerialisation of intellectual property. And this part grew out of a conversation I had with Robert Henry about, and also with one of the people on the project. One of the issues that's risen in the international lawmaking regime for intellectual property has been a concern about synthetic biology, but also just about the dematerialisation of biology. And how is the law going to deal with a situation where you no longer need a physical sample of something to go forward, or you don't need as much? What we're looking at here is a similar practice that occurred in patent law in the 19th century. Up until the 1880s or so, whenever anyone took out a patent on a chemical, they would deposit a sample of the physical chemical, the ingredients that went to make it, and the physical sample of the ingredient. They would deposit those at the patent office as proof of the existence of the object. With the emergence of structural formula and sort of the chemical constitution going forward, that gradually moved across different areas of chemistry at that particular time. It was replaced, the sort of reliance on the physical object was replaced by sort of the paper-based formula. It fundamentally changed the law, and there was, in a sense, a dematerialisation. So we're looking at what happened then, how did the law deal with dematerialisation going forward, and the idea here is to try and use those as examples of things going forward, to think about synthetic biology, how the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources can deal with things going forward. Just one or two other projects and then I'll finish up, and I'm going to open up for discussion. We're doing quite a bit of work as well in relation to farmers' rights and the International Treaty on Plant Genetic Resources. The treaty fundamentally changed the way in which people, physical resources, plant genetic resources are dealt with. It's in some ways quite a conceptual initiative, and in some ways it's a failed concept in many ways. It really hasn't had the impact that it's had. But we're embarking on a project to look at what does the new public domain look like in the international treaty, and what is the relationship and role the law might play in working on those things. We've only really just begun to look at those projects. They are just the early snapshots of what we're looking at. My idea there was just to give you a sense of most of the people involved in the project are in the room today, so I haven't introduced them because I didn't want to embarrass them too much. But the idea behind this was just really to introduce you to some of the key issues that we're doing going forward. The idea is these will be sort of, some of the projects will be longer term, so the historical projects will be longer term, but some of the other projects we're going to be embarking on, so the empirical projects, the biodiscovery laws, we're hoping to move into other spaces very quickly. We now have a team of 10 people working on this project, so we're building up a critical mass going forward. And what we really want to do now is, now we've sort of got our house in order, is to reach out and to talk to you much more and to find out where we can go forward. The CRISPR event, and we do have someone from QAAFI speaking. Who is it? Dave McCullough speaking, and we've got two people, one person from Sydney, one from the States. So that'll be our first joint initiative, but we hope this could be the start of a range of other events. So this is a partly sort of to give you a sense of what's going on, but also to find out what are the points of connection we're willing to, the idea is for us to learn from you, so I'd be just really interested in your feedback and any initiatives and things going forward. So thank you.